back-to-back sessions on shared services, and what's the title? It's Acquisition of Shared Services from an Industry Perspective. I'm paraphrasing there. We had a lively discussion last panel. I jokingly said at the end I'm utterly depressed. In fact, I am energized. I'm glad to hear the industry perspective on things. I want to keep this panel constructive and focused. I'm going to be selfish. I want to hear from you what I can do better to pull in industry into making shared services work as a government. So can I get a quick show of hands and who actually is a federal employee in the room? Okay, good. And who is not? So it's like 50-50, I think. Great. So we talked a lot in the last session about challenges around shared services, and there are a lot. And they're cultural, they're political, they're leadership, they're budgetary, there are movement of money challenges. There are a lot of things, and we can't tackle everything at once. So I want to really have a focused discussion on what do we tackle first. What is the low-hanging fruit we can hit and prove out the model so we can expand and build a stronger case for shared services in government. But first I want to introduce our panel because I think most of you were not here last session. If you are, you're a glutton for punishment. Let's start with ladies first. Rebecca, introduce yourself and
Okay. Not a glutton for punishment, right? If you did stick around, it's just so you saw how much fun you had in the last hour and you want to keep it going.
Yes.
My name is
the eternal optimist.
I will be this hour. My name is Rebecca Weaver. I am with CGI's Federal Solutions Group. I've spent the last 15 years designing and working on the Momentum solution, which is financial management and acquisitions for the federal government. I've also spent the last several months working on an acquisition management SIG project, doing surveys and understanding the challenges that agencies are experiencing when it comes to acquiring shared services. And so while Dominic says that the last hour was negative, unfortunately that was a lot of the feedback that we received from the folks that we have been interviewing over the past couple months, and that's what I was able to share in the last hour.
Kareem Al-Laili, I'm with Sensio Consulting Group. Sensio is a strategy and operations consulting firm that focuses on the federal government and higher ed. I've spent probably the last 8 years, I've probably worked on 6 or 7 shared services strategy and implementations across the private sector, public sector, and higher ed. So I have a decent amount of industry perspective on what works, what doesn't work, and the one big thing, my one big takeaway from having done this for the past few years is that without an executive top-down push, a real concerted push from the top, shared services cannot be successfully implemented. So if we want it to work, and we do because we know that shared services can be more effective, can provide better service levels at a lower cost, we need to make sure that we get executive buy-in.
So I'm Richard Spires, and did 20 years in the private sector in a number of different IT companies, and then I was lured into government service and spent about 4.5 years at the IRS. Ran their modernization program, was their CIO for a while, and actually was the Deputy Commissioner for Ops Support. I then took some time off, and I was asked to come back in as part of the Obama administration, at this time at Department of Homeland Security, where I spent just a little less than 4 years as the CIO, and left a little over a year ago, and now I'm the CEO of a company called Resilient Network Systems.
Thank you. Josh Gage with IBM. I've been working around the federal space since about 2002, both on large-scale IT acquisitions as well as on the business transformation side. So I kind of come at this both from, what is it you're trying to do around IT and moving to shared services, but more importantly, that question of what are you trying to do as an agency in terms of where are you transforming, how are you going to leverage this sort of capability. So,
thank you all. So we'll start with a similar question to how we started the last session, which is, I put out there, I think shared services in large part is an unfulfilled promise within the federal government. I think we can do a lot better. We heard last session there are a lot of barriers to making that happen. But I also recognize that the shared services how we view shared services is different today than we viewed it 10 years ago. and that we've had varying ups and downs in terms of implementation of shared services. So I want to just ask our panel, keep it brief. How successful do you think we've been in implementing shared services, and what are the barriers, and what is the one thing you would do to make that, to improve our approach? Start with Josh.
All right, great. I got to finish last time, and so it was easier. I'll try to keep it simple. So one of the things is, from a framework, perspective, some good work has been done around high-level strategy for shared services, just like there's work around other things like cloud and FedRAMP and security. There was a lot of emphasis on what are the potential underlying business cases associated with it. For HR, OPM, HRLB, $1.6 billion of cost savings. What's been harder to do is to deliver, I think, what would you say, deliver on the promise?
Yes.
What's harder is because to deliver on that, though, it's a little more complex. As government agencies, you don't have all of the tools like my commercial sector clients who, they're driven by profit and loss. They have the ability to say, my executive support says within 6 months, I'm going to move all these new business units to one new HR system or financial system, and done. It's a little more complex in the government, and that's okay. It's then how do we kind of try to work collectively, government to government in terms of GSA with all the agencies, and then government to industry in terms of how vendors and industry sectors can help you through that. So.
Okay. Well, I would agree with your statement that I don't think we've realized the promise of shared services anywhere to the degree that we would have hoped to have. There certainly are some pockets of excellence, like the payroll processing, but for the most part, it's been a rough go. And I liken it to the problem that it's not that there isn't a desire in many people's instances, and believe me, having been in government in a couple of different areas, there's huge potential for value creation, both on the savings side as well as better business and mission support through a number of shared services. But structurally, government is set up to make it's difficult. Right? I mentioned the budget process, just the way it works, the appropriations process, and the way the money is doled out. It makes it very, very difficult to then bring it back. There are franchise funds and things like that, but frankly, you're kind of working against the process, okay, by doing shared services in some ways. And I think the cultures of government organizations don't necessarily lend themselves to easy implementation of shared services, because there's this feeling that somebody's losing out in this process, right? If you really are moving to a true shared services model, they're doing something today to fulfill whatever it is that they're doing. Somebody in that organization is no longer going to be doing that, and there's a lot of holding on to what exists today, and it's hard to give that up in many organizations. And so I think those factors, and Kareem already mentioned it, the fact of the matter is you need tremendous leadership at the top and real drive and real persistence to break those barriers down, and the change management processes to break those barriers down to make shared services work. And in my view, that's been the major stumbling block. It's also the answer, right? I do believe that the right change management process is in place, the right leadership from the top. I've seen some wonderful implementations of shared services that have made tremendously positive results in government. And there's no reasons why we can't continue to replicate that model. I think the good news is, to put a positive on this, I think, at least in the IT world, everything is driving, okay, to make it easier to implement shared services, right? So it is a lot easier to do it today than it was a decade ago. And so a lot of those barriers are crumbling on the actual technology and on the actual business model. Now we need to get through the barriers on some of the internal issues we still face in government.
Great. Kareem?
So Richard eloquently said what I wanted to say. So I will add to that by saying there are successful shared services implementations, whether we're talking about centralizing and outsourcing to a third-party provider, or building up an internal shared services offering within the agency itself. The factors to success are, in all cases, there was a strong executive push from the top. What happens when you do not get that is that when it's left to the staff, the 15s or the SESs on the project to have to go around the entire organization and curry support for this initiative, it's too difficult. There's, like Richard said, there are folks that they're winners and losers, and you need the executives to kind of to push that message out, saying we're going to do this no matter what, and we're going to take care of the folks that are not going to end up on the right side of this coin. When you leave that to your lower level staff, it's an uphill battle that is destined for, let's say, non-success.
Yeah.
Rebecca?
I agree with all of my fellow panelists. There are success stories today. Shared services have been successfully implemented across the government. I think in order to make the future more successful, there are some changes that can be made in terms of standardization. Speaking specifically about acquisitions, there's a lot of ambiguity on how these agreements should be formed and how these agencies should work together to create these internal agreements or interagency agreements. So I think there's some standardization as well as some collaboration that it could occur. There is a number of groups right now that are working together to discuss among the providers, among the consumers, with the policy groups, so that we can learn from these best practices that have already been achieved in a number of the shared service agreements today. And I think that can continue to be expanded.
So Kareem, I'm going to follow up on a point you've made with both, and I think it's something I've heard consistently from you, is the importance of this executive leadership. So I would say the leadership die has pretty much been cast probably through the end of the administration, and it's not going to get any different. We've got the management agenda recently set. Agency leadership is only going to start leaving toward the end of the administration. And here I am, I'm coming in, I feel like I'm somewhat running into a burning building. It's probably an overly negative metaphor, but to some extent, I think there's real opportunity there if we figure out how to do it on enhancing shared services. But give me a reality check. Should I be focused on a couple of agencies where that leadership is in place? I'm going to assume, and perhaps push back if I'm wrong, that this leadership isn't all going to sudden pop out at the executive office of the president level at this point. If you see signals of that, let me know. But what's your advice? Do I just focus on just doing this right in a couple of agencies? Do I try to go for more structural changes? Do I do both? What would you do if you were in my position trying to create a center for shared services for government?
I'll give you the both advice. How's that? I mean, because seriously, look at it. Commercial sector or public sector, it almost doesn't matter. The majority of those kinds of transformations, that kind of change, are typically built out of a lot of times out of crisis. I mean, some of the most successful ones are where my budget or my bottom line for a private sector company has got to change and change very quickly. So it's driven by a burning platform. So to me, you need to find those agencies where there is a real driver for change, because otherwise it's just a great idea. And it's that's when it's even harder to get the kind of meaningful executive support that Kareem was saying. On the other side, though, you need that thought leader, and there's good examples across the government, federal government, in terms of agencies that have stepped out to either be a provider or be at the front of the pack in terms of being a consumer of shared services from another provider. So I mean, to me, you need both. I know that doesn't
What do you
help.
see as some of those examples? Are you able to get into that?
What's that?
Are you able to get into what some of these examples are of where agencies that are doing it right?
Sure, I'll give you an example. Well, one that comes to mind, one that we work with is VA. I mean, who's really stepped out there in terms of a very large federal agency, a lot of employees, with a complex mission set that is critical to the veteran, the men and women who've served our country. And they went out and selected IBM as the first federal agency to use an outside non-agency provider. To me, took a lot of thought leadership on their perspective.
Kareem.
So what advice I would actually have for you is, yeah, go where there is already executive support and go after the low-hanging fruit. So IT might be difficult, but you've got, maybe finance, HR, and acquisitions are easier. Maybe real property is easier than IT, but eventually you got to collect some wins in order to generate the buy-in to get everyone across the government to say, oh yeah, this is now we can really do this and we can do this successfully. But let me pose a question to the audience. Please raise your hand if you've heard of a successful shared services implementation in the federal government.
Or better been involved in it.
So maybe a quarter of the people here. So we're not doing a good enough job, the government, of saying, hey, we've done this before and we've done this successfully and we can continue doing this. And that is part of the issue. So we just need to celebrate our successes more, highlight the VA and the other agencies that have done this and say, look, talk to those people, talk to the customers there, talk to the leadership there, find out how they did it and what they feel about it, and get that buy-in that way, and eventually you'll get enough momentum that it should be a no-brainer.
Can I ask a question? Sure. David Dasvar from Infosys. What is the metric for you to call a shared services successful? Like you mentioned, there are some very successful or good shared service implementation. Can you give us some metrics? Great question. What is a successful shared service implementation?
I think it's going to depend on the agency and what it is that you're moving to a shared services environment. If you have a successful transition, if the services are successfully transitioned over, if you realize cost savings, depending on the agency and how they choose to measure it, I think it's up to the agency to define how they want to set something as successful.
Is it successful if you break even?
If it means that you're getting better services out of it, then I would vote yes.
I would agree with that. I mean, I mentioned in my open remarks, probably the one that comes to mind that's been the most successful is the payroll processing in the federal government. That was at one point, now this goes back a ways, I'm thinking 15 years even, something like more than that. But at one point, all these agencies were essentially doing their own thing. And now we have just a couple of payroll processors that handle for the federal government. Much more efficient, saves a lot of money. And it's the kind of thing that lends itself well to a shared service, right? Because really how you pay your people, I mean, that payroll processing is pretty standardized. I mean, certainly I've been engaged. I mean, this isn't about my own work, but I felt like what we were doing at DHS was quite successful in shared services on some of the IT areas. Now, on the other hand, we could have done a lot more. I mean, this is where it got hard, right? I mean, we were driving real change and real consolidation in some areas, but there was a lot more that could have been done. And we were running, the typical cultural roadblocks that I mentioned earlier and running into those. But it was saving a lot of money, and I would argue providing better level of service to everybody that was using it.
Yeah. I would add, though, too, that I think the definition of success, the business value that gets defined up front needs to change for the government. It's hard to look back. I think it's next to impossible in most cases to go back and say, did I get the cost savings, or was I able to realize, no kidding, cost takeout or avoidance, and see that in a bottom line agency budget statement. But where I think this is the federal government, this is a mission-focused business, and the real promise of shared service for me, as someone, and I focus on the human capital perspective, is what I want to see, what I want my clients to see and go, I want to move to shared services, because they want to change the entire dynamic of what they do as an HR business. Today, 90% transactional. I move this stuff to shared services. I take advantage of employee self-service, manager self-service. I change the way I do my work. What is the value that gets created out of being now a strategic HR provider as an agency? That's the value that's not visible today, and the kind of stuff that you have to have that sense of value if you're going to get the kind of sustained executive sponsorship to carry these things through. Because we mentioned earlier, this is not like a 3-year buy, that you have to go through the budgeting process. In most cases, you're looking at a 10-year 10-year service contract if you're going to do it right, to say, I'm in this for the long haul. So what does that mean in terms of success? So I think we can do better.
Can I come back to your question about advice? And picking up on this point, I mean, you're coming to the, as you said, 2 years left in this administration, a little bit more than that, and that raises the whole problem of major change in political leadership over these 2 years and going into the new administration, which makes it very difficult to get in place major change initiatives that are going to be long time. So I would, if I were in your shoes, Dominic, I would be spending my time right now in really working with industry like ACT-I-ACT here and understanding from a commercial perspective best practices, but also finding a few really good success stories, right, that have worked in government, and if you will, distilling that down into a strong set of both examples of what works, and then also what are the cookbook, right? Here are the 10 things you must do well in order to implement shared services in federal government, so that you can then be prepared to work with agencies or GSA or whatever as you launch the next administration, be really prepared to help them launch out with series. We absolutely must solve this problem. I am absolutely convinced that we are kind of spiraling the wrong way in this in some ways. We're spending more and more of our dollars, at least in IT, on legacy, when we very quickly could flip that. Most of that could go into new infrastructure in a shared services model, lower the price point, get better service, and be more secure. I know that's a big statement to make, but I'm absolutely convinced that we could do that. And I think you're the guy
I
right
agree.
there that can position us to help do that next administration.
I completely agree. I think that the external pressure seems to me much greater than the pressure within government.
Yep.
So I heard what I sense was like we're conflicting opinions around what's the next frontier of shared services. I think, Kareem, you said something about don't focus on IT, focus on financial management and I think acquisition or something. And Richard, you seem like IT is the place to be. What market do I go into? If you were in my position,
That's a good
what's the next market? What is the next frontier?
Maybe one thing that could be a simple thing to think about, and I've met a smart man in the hallway. I can't remember his name, so I'll take credit for it. When we're talking about the big lines of business, so like HR, LOB, or finance, the approach to date is I'm going to move to this HR shared services thing. But what all comes along with that in today's world? Authentication, single sign-on. There's a lot of commodity IT sorts of things that I think if the government helped facilitate the adoption of and migration in terms of some of those core kind of, I'll call them ancillary commodity capabilities, that would begin get the marketplace moving. B, for a larger scale shared services migration, those are the things that become a challenge and all of a sudden get added into a solution design as you're moving forward with implementation. I'm going with PeopleSoft, but now I got to do single sign-on. These are like the add-ons that come down the road. Making headway on those commodity type things, I think could simplify the implementation for larger scale shared service type solutions. So just thinking out loud here,
But I think you're seeing both. right?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're not going towards one or the other. I think we're doing both, and we just have a difference in perspectives here on the panel.
Good.
But it's, it's going to continue evolving, and we're going to frequently see more services or more commodity-based items that can be moved into a shared services environment.
But by the way, I'm not against, I don't want to come across like I'm like advocating not going to an HR line of business or a
No, and
financial.
I
I'm a
didn't-
big advocate of those too. I'm also a huge advocate of basic commodity IT services, whether, I mean, we already since do a lot of it on the bandwidth telecom side, right?
Yep.
Through GSA. But there's other areas that really are crying that could leverage it, and obviously the cloud-based models for much of these services now. But I believe wholeheartedly, I mean, I was dismayed at DHS where we were working on HR, and when you count up the 138 legacy HR systems you have, you go, there's really something wrong with this picture, right? And so I think you can do both. And I think you should look at models that would have you move forward in both, Dominic.
Kareem, why are they all wrong?
No, I don't think they are. I think you have to do both. I think though my point was you should do the easy stuff too and celebrate that. Pluck that low-hanging fruit, get a few wins under your belt, and then it'll make it easier to get the buy-in for the more complicated stuff, the IT stuff. But I do think you need to start now on everything, but use the momentum to help you down the line.
Yeah, so I just want to throw out, I think some of the problems with focusing on IT, although I do think it's one of the first things to focus on, is they're not as easy to tout, they're less visible. So for example, at GSA, we run the federal PKI bridge, we run the whole infrastructure. No one notices that, yet it's a successful shared service run on behalf of all agencies. Unless something goes wrong, nobody notices. Is that the kind of example we need to suss out and promote out there, put out there?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's not out there widely enough.
Yeah.
And you
Yes.
mentioned this 2-year period where it's hard to get new initiatives started. This is the time when you should be gathering those success stories so that you can, once the new administration is in place or executive has changed over, then you have the ability to say, look, these are our success stories. This is why we should be making this move in this next administration.
Any other comments?
The one thing that I think we should share that we talked about last time, we were talking about government industry collaboration, or how they could work together better.
Yep.
And the one thing we started talking about in the previous session was from a solution design perspective, where there's greater standardization of business process on the government side for a function, it's so much easier for then a standardized solution to be provided that does not end up being 30, 40, 60, in some cases customized beyond where it's no longer COTS. That's something in terms of continuing down that path of government standards for really the requirement and so for the software spec, because what I've experienced is then you're going to shared services, but the approach down at the agency level is like any other IT modernization or replacement. And so it still opens the door for having to adapt a solution that was designed to be shared, vice adopting it. And it's that culture of adoption that's going to allow more than one agency to use the same thing.
Does anyone disagree with that? Because I hear at least on IT shared solutions, I hear a lot, agencies just need to adapt to the product. We need to get out of this business of, continuing to try to work our requirements into things. And you mentioned momentum. I mean, I was involved with the GM, the grants management line of business, like 7 years ago. It was already mature at that point. And they've been talking business process reengineering for years. Yet I think this is one area where we really have not fulfilled the promise of the full end-to-end grants processing. Is a certain aspect of this, are there certain expectations we should have? Or do you think we can get there with the right focus this time? Or are there some things that just aren't possible, just too hard to do when it comes to kind of re-engineering how government works?
Well, yeah, I think you're bringing up a great point. Where do you draw those lines? And You know, and this is what does concern me about some of these lines of business that are at the application level, because you are asking to try to standardize certain things across agencies, right, that generally they haven't been willing to do, right? And grants management would be a good example of that. Even the financial side, right? I mean, they standardize, there are obviously the rules around financial management for federal government, but even within that, there's a lot of variability from agency to agency. So, and I'm not saying you shouldn't be driving towards that, but I think government has struggled with that, right? And I've been part of some working groups that have been trying to do that. One of the reasons why I push the IT more commodity stuff is that, I mean, let's face it, let's take email as a simple example. I mean, you might have different size mailboxes and memory and things like that, and there's certain things, but it's a pretty commodity kind of buy now, right? I mean, there's not an awful lot of variation there. And I think that's part of the low-hanging fruit, right?
Right.
Start with some things that you know could really, at least within an agency, if not across the federal government, can truly be bought as a commodity, right? And maybe you have a few different flavors to offer, but you're not having to customize them. They're essentially what industry will already provide you out of the box. And if you can stick with that, I think you put yourself in a much greater position. And let me just, one other point I made last thing that is very important about this. I pushed very hard as the CIO to let's take the attitude, guys, of let's buy the product as is and try to influence where it goes as a major customer, rather than delaying implementing something that's going to provide us real value until they meet every single requirement we have. I mean, that's what government has tended to do too much in the past. And I think that mindset needs to shift as we move to a more commodity-based shared services model.
Rebecca, what do you think?
So as somebody who's worked on a solution that is used across government for a number of years, nobody likes BPR when a new system's coming in. You want the system to work in your current environment. And it's very frustrating to procure a new system and then find that then you have to also change your business processes in order to align with them. But in a shared services arrangement, you have to understand that the benefits are that you're going to the standard process. And I think that you have to have the outcome in your mind as you are evaluating this new solution and moving into it. One of the biggest benefits is that over time in a standard environment, you have the ability to reflect legislative changes that much more rapidly because they're being applied across the entire user base, as opposed to having a solution that's so specific to your particular agency that then you have to implement each one of those legislative changes incrementally within your own solution. I'm not sure if I actually addressed your question. It's just what I wanted to say.
So, show of hands, the government needs to be more flexible or industry needs to build more flexible tools. Who thinks the government needs to be more flexible?
I'm going to raise my hand for both.
And who thinks industry should be building more flexible tools? Okay.
I absolutely think that there's a matter of configuration that should be within every solution so that an agency can have some specific business processes that they can configure within their system without doing customizations.
So I was going to say, I think it's both, but I think what you'll find is industry wants to provide you with services, and the telecommunications industry is different than the transportation industry, different from pharmaceuticals. But for some reason, on the commercial side, we can provide a hosted shared services solution and bring any of those clients on in a much more rapid way because they're driven by a business need of, I know why I'm doing this and I'm going to make this successful and I'm going to be on your system in 6 months or less. On the government side, that's where there is a cultural thing to say, I'm so much different than the National Forest Service or EPA or this, but the fact of the matter is you do have standardized, and I'll use the HR as an example because that's where I come from. But there is standardization in terms of OPM, human resource management, policies. That's where these legislative changes come out of. So there's opportunity for greater, I'll call it, similarity of requirements. But that's where, embracing COTS, embracing an adopt, vice adapt, but vendors are going to come in with that configurability to say, now your nuanced need for this particular mission set that is different than everyone else's, we can find a way to meet it. So there's a meeting of the minds there that's naturally.
I don't want to beat a dead horse, but if the government was more flexible on the requirements, you'd have a lot more vendors pitching services to the government, because a lot of vendors they won't enter the federal market because there's too onerous. So a little flexibility could go a long way in providing a whole bunch of new solutions that the government could leverage.
Great. So to make that happen, it's probably going to require more interaction between government and industry. Is enough of that interaction happening now? Well, and if not, what can we do to improve that?
Okay, so I can start. I think it is happening at a lot of levels right now. I mean, look at us today, right? This is ACT-IAC. We have, when we polled the room, we are half and half government and industry. We are working together. So I've been involved in this study for ACT-IAC, for the acquisition management SIG, where we've been polling shared service providers and consumers. And we've heard a lot about collaboration and how it's occurring amongst the providers and amongst the consumers and within those various levels. We haven't heard that industry's been involved. And so I think that is an opportunity related to shared services where there is an opportunity to bring industry in, to get industry perspective and our input. If we're going to be stakeholders in this process as well, I think it would benefit the government to get us involved early.
Anybody else?
Well put.
Involved enough? Are you happy with the level of involvement? Do you feel like you're an equal at the table or subordinate? Or
I think there could be more involvement of industry. I know a lot of I've run into a lot of folks that are attempting to implement or strategizing around shared services that haven't spoken to folks in the industry. I mean, granted, there's dozens of agencies that are looking at this, so there's a lot of people that are starting to kick the tires on this. But I think more getting in front of those people is important to share perspectives and experience.
I would say, and I was not able to attend the Uncle Sam's List panel because I'm wondering to what degree they're talking about this. But I mean, to me, there's definitely need for more, and I just want to kind of focus on the benefits you get out of it. One is what we were saying a minute ago in terms of the ability of vendors, multiple vendors, to be able to better meet a shared, I'll call it shared requirement across government. So working collaboratively to simplify and what those requirements are for different business functions and getting then the right kinds of solutions designed that can be implemented in a government environment. Because a lot of vendors shy away, because of other things that need to be kind of thought of in that mix in terms of FSMA, FedRAMP, other sorts of things that they're like, I don't even understand it. So that aspect. The other thing is, what do you get out of coming together as a federal government set of agencies to those providers? So there's a lot of work that's been done around like Uncle Sam's List or Smart Buy type of initiatives, and I think there's a lot to be gained there.
any questions from the audience? So I think we got about 10 minutes left. We have time for a couple. Sure. And your name and your organization?
Hi, my name is Eric Cohen. I work at the Federal Trade Commission. I'm a program manager in the IT department. And so one of the barriers to, I guess switching to shared services, which people don't talk about, but I think is one of the biggies, is people, to switch to a different application, you have to switch interfaces, and that's why a lot of people don't want to change to a shared service provider or change applications. And I noticed, in my career, just the explosion of the number of applications that each individual federal employee has to go through to complete his job. In the good old days, the only interface you had was a form, a person, and a telephone, right? And everyone knew how to use it. Now, even for our timekeeping system, we have a shared service provider that we enter our time through, and we have a custom app that we enter our time through. So is industry doing anything about this just diversity of interfaces that just keeps on increasing as people are using more and more apps? Is industry doing anything to try to standardize the experience for users so they don't have to be trained and remember every single system?
And is this a problem you're aware of and working on?
So I'm not going to answer from an industry perspective, but I'm watching government agencies making this switch, where government agencies are noticing that there are too many interfaces and there are too many different systems that they have to input things into. And that's starting to be one of the big drivers for their future budgets of consolidating these systems, making it single sign-on, creating a one-stop shop. And so from my perspective, it's actually government that's driving the bus on this and making the improvements necessary.
Let me jump in as a former CIO a couple times. I mean, I think what government, I mean, I don't think this is so much a shared services issue, it's a good planning issue. I mean, I think government has done it to itself. I mean, I enter these organizations and when you have a plethora of systems that clearly were not designed to work well together, who's paying the price? The user's paying the price, right? And so none of this obviates the need to do very good planning, right? And to really understand a particular domain and what it is that the IT organization needs to do to support the business processes or the mission processes, and how to work with those business owners to, over time, streamline that, make it best for the user. And then as appropriate, right, I think that's where you start. Then as appropriate, what can be used in shared services to help you answer that? And that's a transformational kind of model that I certainly was trying to implement. I don't think it's a shared services issue as much as it's, I'm fearful government in many places has created a lot of that over time.
It's the onion that you just started peeling back here is application rationalization, consolidation. All those applications that need to be connected, all of those connections in your legacy environment where it takes how many HR-related systems you say?
Well, we had 138 in DHS.
That's a legacy view that makes your data world pretty complex. One of the things, so to me that's part of the strategy. That's part of how you focus on that budgeting and planning based upon a clear acquisition strategy. The future that it opens up is now I'm moving to an enterprise shared services thing. I've reduced and consolidated all these apps. Before you make the transition, one of the key things, please, as agencies, is you need to get a hold of that data because you can move it to a new shared services platform, but if you don't have that back end right, you're going to have the same issues no matter what platform you're on. So, but the promise it opens up is what additional ways to connect are we talking about? Because what's rapidly happening is your customers, so employees at a government agency or consumers of your government agency, smartphones, mobile, all of the broad array of now how do I get access to that service? That's the next wave of expectation that we got to get the platform right, have it adaptable enough, and we kind of talked about the need for adaptability earlier. That's kind of the coming wave in terms of the expectations from the customers that are going to be accessing this.
Any other questions? Back here.
I think Mr. Spy touched on this earlier, but I would like to hear a little bit more comment on shared services within the agency. In your view, it's more like a two-step process, or is that, today I heard a lot about from interagency or industry and industry. So I know that there's a lot of agencies that still operate their own line of business and IT. So I would like to hear some comment how to move forward the path.
I was explaining the last panel that when you look at your shared services strategy, my suggestion is always look internal first, and if you can't do it internally efficiently or effectively or quickly, then you start looking at other agencies or private sector to do that. There are plenty of examples in the federal government of successful shared services implementations in finance, HR, acquisitions, IT, maybe less so in IT, but there are good examples. Like I said in the beginning of the conversation, all of them, like the one characteristic they all shared was strong executive push to get it done. But yes, I'm a big fan of looking internally first to see if you can consolidate, eliminate work, build a shared service, determine how you're going to charge for that service, whether you're going to do pay by the drink or whether you're going to just do kind of a upfront, annual tax on each office. But that way can work for the government. It has worked, and it should not be discounted.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think because the federal government is so large, right, it just, it kind of boggles the mind of this idea of how far you can push it at a federal level. That being said, I think there are specific areas where the GSA, for instance, probably can take some more leadership position in offering shared services that agencies then could take advantage of. But this notion of larger organizations, though certainly the department levels, I believe driving towards sets of shared services does make a lot of sense, and I think that's the right level at which you should start that consolidation. But I would urge Dominic to take a look at things like where are there areas, like the PKI bridge, things like that, where offering it at a federal level can make a lot of sense because it can help the whole federal government operate more efficiently, right? And where are those nuggets that you could offer as GSA?
Any other offers of advice? Any parting thoughts for me? Where to, what market to focus in, whether it be large agencies, small agencies, a specific market like somewhere around identity management, which is another part of the business I have at GSA. Any hot spots you think I could go at right now, walking out the door and focus on today? Rebecca?
Oh, golly. It's a matter of looking at your business. Look at what you're doing today, what is being done across government that's repeatable and standardized, and finding those solutions, either becoming the provider yourself or a consumer of somebody else's services.
I thought you brought up a good point, about the size of the organization. It does seem to me, and I've dealt with some of the smaller government organizations that are trying to still roll their own on some things, where it would seem to me, you just look at it and you go, wow, this is just begging for a shared services solution. And let me make another analogy here. I'm running a small startup organization, which is obviously a very different role than I was in government. But in today's, if you go to any startup and you talk to VCs, and 10 years ago you'd have to worry about all these things. You know what? You buy everything now as a startup as a shared service. Just about everything you buy as a shared service and in your infrastructure, right? And all of your support services and your HR and all that. It's all shared services. Do you know that whole model in commercial has swung completely from one side to the other within about a decade, right? So it's going to happen in government. I think it's just a matter of time. I'd like to think that with the right leadership, we can accelerate that movement in the federal government, where I think it should be accelerated.
Kareem, any advice?
I think the trend is to talk about finance and HR and IT. I believe acquisitions and administration offer a lot of low-hanging fruit. I know GSA has done a good job with fleet and property, but I think they can do an even better job to become a broader, a truer shared service to the entire government. There should be no property managers at the office level or at the bureau level. GSA should be taking care of all that, in my opinion. So that's one potential area to consider.
Josh?
I don't know how to finish out on that. No, I think that the things that are, are obvious. I mean, you mentioned of identity management, things that are common, commodity type of things that are needed by every agency in every every IT application. To me, there's a tremendous amount of headway, and the complexity that would reduce for even then other shared service like line of business type solutions is immense. So if I can go as an agency, I want to do HR, and I don't have to then also do identity management, and authentication, and this and that and the other. I mean, it's a no-brainer. So to me, that's where you start at. And then the other thing, what we were talking about earlier, is how how can we get beyond admiring the problem of this is complex and hard, and I think focusing in on some actionable things around the policy alignment, the implementation kind of support that someone in the IT shop over there, who's trying to translate and make sense out of all these policies and compliance things that he has to factor in. I think it's enabling the program to take hold and be implemented. So happy to be involved in that.
Well, this has been, I think we're at the end of our time. It's been an absolute pleasure to moderate this panel. I've learned a lot today. I hope we've all learned a little bit today. I want to open, my email address is dominic.sale@gsa.gov. If you've got feedback on how we can do a better job, I want to take that position as being a point of coordination for that. So I look forward to hearing and continue. This is the beginning of a dialogue for me, and I hope for all of you as well. So thank you very much, and thank you all for coming today.